Hey guys, I've been tossing around the idea of making a video of the WR250R versus the DRZ400 for quite some time now. Not only because there's been a lot of requests for it on my channel, but also because out of all of the bikes I've ever owned, these two are my favorite by a long shot. Just for that reason alone, I feel as if they deserve the spotlight for a video. I haven't ridden any other bikes that gave me such a high level of enjoyment with such little maintenance required. I'd absolutely love a new European bike with 40 to 50 horsepower like the Beta 390. But the WR and DRZ have service intervals measured in thousands of miles, whereas those high-performance dual sport service intervals will be measured in hours. I see and hear constantly, both online and in person, about how those Euro service intervals can be stretched out too, but they'll still never see 60 to 70,000 miles on a stock top end, let alone 3,000 miles on one oil change. Even the CRF450L can't do that, but that is something both the DRZ and WR are capable of. But I can't stand falling in love with the WR250R and DRZ400. Now, before we dive into this, I want to give a little bit of background on myself for those of you that don't know me. I'm 6'7", 290 pounds. I started out riding dirt bikes around a decade ago on a 1993 RM125, but I've been riding dual sports for roughly 6 to 7 years now. In that time frame, I've owned a KLR 650, KLX 650C, DRZ400, Africa Twin, WR250R, YZ250F, DR650, and a KTM 250 SXF. My old 2002 DRZ400 I owned for slightly over 2 years and put about 3,000 almost all off-road miles on it. My 2008 WR250R I bought about 3 years ago and still own it to this day. I also have a 2019 WR250R and have ridden loads of other WRs on top of that. Between them, I probably have a cumulative of about 5,000 miles on them, which again is almost all off-road miles. Having owned all those bikes, I've ridden a lot more. Just off the top of my head, I can tell you I've ridden a CRF450L, CRF250L, XR650L, XL600R, KLR 250, KLX 250S, DR350, TW200, XT250, Beta 390 RRS, KTM 300 XCW, and a 525 EXC, and the list just goes on. You guys get the point. I'd categorize myself as a 90-10 dirt road rider, and I really prefer riding technical single track and don't get much enjoyment from road riding and easier trails. I'm no expert by any means, but I definitely have the ability to keep myself upright and moving in some pretty tough situations.
Oh wow, dude.
So, just to clear this up right away, I'm going to try my hardest not to perpetuate the same washed up opinion that everyone else gives you when comparing these two bikes. I'm going to try and provide you guys with a unique perspective that I feel will actually be beneficial to you, the viewers, or future buyers. I feel as if when people compare these two, they always focus on just paper spec sheet facts like the WR has EFI, DRZ doesn't, and WR has 6 gears, DRZ doesn't. Those aren't the biggest differences, and things listed on paper should not be a focus of comparison in the first place. That's all stuff you can find from a simple internet search. One thing I also will not be talking about is reliability, because both of these bikes are absolutely bulletproof, and that point does not need to be covered. I only had one issue with my DRZ in the 2 years of ownerships and have not had one single issue with my WR in 3+ years of ownership. Also, I'm not getting paid for this at all. I'm not sponsored by anyone or any entity. So everything you're going to hear in this review is going to be my honest experiences and thoughts after having owned them for years. I'm definitely not going to try and sway you in either direction because I honestly don't care which one you ultimately end up buying. I have no need to justify my purchase because I've literally owned both of these bikes for years now. I know what they're like. I know what I want as well. I absolutely love both of these machines, and you should too. They are the best dual sports on the market, in my opinion. Having gotten that out of the way, let's dive into this. I'm going to tell you guys right away what I think the 3 biggest differences between these bikes is. First biggest difference is the power and how it's made. Second is how the bikes carry their weight. And the third is going to be ergonomics. I'm going to focus on the last 2 specifically. The first is the most noticeable difference, but the second, other reviewers tend to gloss over this quite frequently, or they just don't get into much detail with it in general. We'll start this off with the first point though, how the bikes make their power. Getting this out of the way immediately, if you don't like revving your bike out, avoid the WR250R. Unless you're a beginner, you will not be getting enjoyment out of this bike unless you're wringing it out. You can take my word for it though, this bike can handle the abuse, whether you're crashing it all the time or taking it up to 11,000 RPMs daily. Every day I ride my WR, it sees the rev limiter at least once, sometimes more than I can count on my hands and toes. And I haven't had an issue with it for the last 3 years. Another thing I want to point out is that if you're concerned about if the WR250R has enough power, don't be. I'm 300 pounds and it's enough to haul me at 65 to 70 miles per hour all day long. And that's something I really don't enjoy doing on any bike. I've owned bikes with well over 100 horsepower, and the WR and DRZ are the 2 most fun bikes I have ever owned. The WR250R makes its power like a 125 two-stroke bike does. Very little punch on the bottom, but once you get to the top, the power is very similar to the DRZ400. Because of how the WR builds power, it's going to make slower off-road riding a nightmare for newer dirt riders, because this bike requires a lot more clutch control. It's not a bike that's going to get you into like whiskey throttle trouble per se, but if you come up on an obstacle, don't have the clutch finesse, or just half-ass it in general, you're going to end up hurt. In that regard, the DRZ is easier to manage. Power-wise, you can just ride the DRZ more lazily. So if you're a newer dirt rider looking to get into harder off-roading, and you're considering one of these 2, I would spring for the DRZ400. The power curve on the WR is very linear, and it's extremely easy to manage though, so that is a plus. The DRZ400 on the other hand is a different story. It makes slightly more peak power, and it hits hard right off the bottom. For that fact alone, the power and how it's made just gives this bike a bigger fun factor in general. Stuff like hopping logs and doing wheelies will require less effort and a lot less clutch finesse on the DRZ. When riding slower technical stuff, that power can get an untrained wrist into a lot of trouble though, which ironically I have video footage of.
That really hurt.
One thing I do want to mention too is that the DRZ responds much better to power mods. You do the 3x3 mod, jetting, and a pipe, it completely transforms the bike. I was able to pull 4th gear wheelies after that on my DRZ. In my experience, having owned 2 WRs and riding probably 5 to 6 other ones, some modded, some not, they just don't feel any different after adding pipes and programmers. It's just not worth the extra money unless you're looking for a decibel increase, in my opinion. Yamaha did a great job squeezing every bit they could out of that little 250. It's just impressive that a 250 can even compete power-wise with a 400, especially while having longer maintenance intervals as well. The valve checks on the WR250R are over 10,000 miles longer, and that just blows my mind. Oil change intervals are about the same though. Both of these bikes are pretty good on the road. If you're blasting around town or riding back roads, I'd take the DRZ all day. But when it comes to highway work, I actually prefer the WR250R, even with the less low-end punch that it has. And that's mainly because the DRZ is absolutely screaming at highway speeds, and it's geared very stupidly. The WR has 6 gears, and it actually feels like it has 6 gears, whereas the DRZ has 5 gears, yet it feels like it has 4 to 4.5 gears.
It's not. I was thinking that somebody broke the dam.
How the DRZ is geared is great for dirt riding, but not great for road work. The WR definitely has the better transmission for dual sporting. Now, in between point, I'm going to talk about the motors and fueling between these two bikes. A big selling point for me on the WR was EFI. I do a lot of cold weather riding, and I didn't realize how convenient it was to have fuel injection until I owned it. With my old DRZ and temperatures less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, I had to choke it, crank it for probably 30 seconds straight, let it idle for 3 to 5 minutes while still being choked. If I touched the throttle, it would die, and then I could finally ride it. It sounds like a nitpick and it sounds small, but it's a big nuisance, especially when compared to the WR, where it pops off in a couple cranks and I can ride it immediately. No need to warm it up. This particular issue would be worse if I had a pumper carb on the DRZ too. Another thing I hated about the DRZ's carb was the fact that every time I dropped it or tipped it over, I'd sit there having to crank it over for a few minutes because the carb is flooded due to the fact that there's no overflow on it.
I can see you.
And that's like some California emissions thing. Now, I know Electron carb or even a pumper carb would solve both of these issues on the DRZ, but that's an extra $600 to $800 you'd have to spend to solve an issue that doesn't even exist on the WR. Now, I hear and see a lot of people online talking about how they'd rather have a carb because they can fix it on the side of the road, or I'm never going to go back to carbs because EFI is vastly superior. Me. Both of the fueling solutions on these bikes are extremely reliable. Unless you're experiencing massive elevation changes constantly, or you live in a temperate climate like me, don't let the carb versus EFI debate influence your purchasing decision at all. In the 2 years of ownership on my DRZ, I had one failure that was carb related. The vacuum diaphragm failed, which is an easy fix, although it did leave me stranded. And in the 3 years of owning both of my WRs, I haven't had a single issue with the EFI, and neither have my 5 or 6 other friends with WRs and DRZs. And that's counting the fact that I've ridden in really deep water on both of these bikes and super rainy days. I have video evidence for both as well, so
Woo! I got the front end up a bit on that one.
Moving on, unlike bikes like the KLR 650 and DR 650, the motors on either of these bikes don't really have any lingering issues that need to be addressed immediately. I figured I'd throw that out there in case anybody was wondering. Small side note in regards to the engine on the DRZ, the oil change process is a little bit more complicated than the WR. There's 3 drain bolts, one for the oil frame tank, crankcase, and oil filter. Then there's the oil filter itself, and a screen filter that you need to clean with contact cleaner every now and then. Plus, you also have to let the bike idle for a few minutes just to check the oil level because of that separated oil tank. With the WR, it's just one plug to drain, change the filter, and use sight glass to check. It's a much easier process. Sorry for the slight diversion, but I digress. Now we'll move on to the second point. How the bikes carry their weight. These two bikes aren't far off from each other in like spec sheet weight, but plain and simple, the WR250R just carries its weight lower. It's only like 25 pounds lighter on paper, but it feels like 50 plus pounds when actually riding in the slower stuff off-road. The WR clearly has a lower center of gravity, and it's balanced much better in my opinion. All while having just a more planted feel in general. In slower technical terrain, I always felt as if the DRZ was top heavy and clumsy, but the WR feels like a dirt bike with a street bike motor. Going into berms, riding slowly, standing up, and just technical maneuvers in general are just easier on the WR. Using a wildly exaggerated statement to kind of help those who don't understand what I'm trying to get at here, the DRZ400 feels like a dual sport with a very smooth dirt bike motor, and the WR250R feels like a dirt bike with a street bike motor. Now, that's not saying the WR is going to be bad on the street or the DRZ terrible in the dirt. It's just an overstatement to kind of get the point across to help you differentiate between the two. So, basically, get the WR if you care about precise handling off-road, and get the DRZ if you just want that bottom end punch to swing the rear end out in a churn, roost your buddy, or if you just want to dig a hole to the core of the earth. Granted, you could do the first two on the WR as well, but again, you'll need lots of revving and clutch dumping to make that happen. Closing on this point, if I enjoyed riding the faster paced stuff, I'd probably still have my DRZ400. Just the bottom end hit would make that bike a blast in the desert or on some like wide open forest roads in general. Now, we'll slowly move into my third and final point while talking through this, but I want to talk about the chassis and suspension quick, and this is one area where the two differ again, and it's kind of has to do with how the bikes carry their weight as well, so I figured I'd throw it in here. The DRZ has a steel chassis with conventional forks, and the WR has an aluminum chassis with upside down forks. The chassis on both bikes are really stout, but the WR has the pretty clear advantage here. You get a really solid chunk of aluminum that's not only lighter, but it also adds rigidity to the platforms to give the rider better feedback. One thing I also want to throw in quick is that both of these bikes can take a serious beating. If you do anything to bend or break the frame or any vital component on these machines in general, you're probably close to death yourself. While we're on the topic of chassis, I might as well slide into my final point now, ergonomics. So the DRZ does have a slightly higher seat height with the same ground clearance as the WR. Sorry. But the cockpit is still more cramped because the bars sit very low and the foot pegs are mounted higher up on the frame. so you get the feeling you're riding on top of the bike rather than in it. So straight out of the box, the WR is going to have the slight edge for taller folks. This is easily remedied with modifications on the DRZ though, and I can tell you the stock cables will work with about 3 to 4 inches of bar rise. All you have to do is flip the throttle housing upside down and you'll have to reroute the clutch cable. But the WR can be made even better for taller riders as well. My personal setup includes Tusk CR High Chub bars, 2-inch rocks pivoting risers, Seat Concepts tall seat, and Fastway drop pegs. To make all that work, I had to flip the throttle housing again, and I had to buy a plus 2-inch clutch cable as well from Motion Pro. It works great for me and I can nearly stand up straight, and like I said, I'm 6'7". Onto the suspension. The rear shocks I peel are pretty similar, both valved and sprung very soft, with the DRZ having a slight edge in rebound dampening. The forks are a different story though. The DRZ has 49mm conventional forks that are again valved and sprung softly, but they're decent. My biggest issue with them when I owned the DRZ was that every crash I had, the forks would get misaligned because there's not much rigidity up at the top of the triple tree.
Jesus Christ. That wasn't long.
Just in general, conventional forks give you less ground to handlebar feedback, and that's because the weakest part of the stanchion is mounted to the triple tree. The majority of the time this is honestly more of a preference thing, but I've never had my forks get misaligned crashing my WR. One big benefit of conventional forks is that fork seals tend to last longer. Simply put, it's because the oil seals aren't working against gravity. Moving on to the WR, it has 46mm inverted forks, which in my opinion have slightly better valving stock, both compression and rebound. Both bikes have complete adjustability, and you'll find valving and spring kits for both pretty easily. Regardless of what you purchase though, if you plan on doing harder off-road or just jumping in general and you're more than 180 pounds, you're going to have to revalve and respring. So that concludes the 3 main points I wanted to cover on these bikes. Now let's move into some of the things I both love and hate about these machines. On the WR250R, I absolutely hate how the radiator shrouds are a two-piece setup. They bust apart too easily, and they simply shouldn't be designed the way they are. Also, I really hate the turn signal switch on the WR. It's just plain trash. It's not tactile, there's little feedback, and it gets gummed up with dirt and debris way too easily. One thing I will say I love about the WR though, is how the dash has its own little built-in diagnostics mode. Like, you know how cars need that little scan tool to read codes? This bike has that built right into the dash. Why don't they all do this? With the DRZ, I hated the added complexity of changing the oil and just checking the oil. I also hated how the airbox panel mounted up. Those little churning clips are junk to me. They always broke, and the panels just never seemed to line up properly. I also hate how high up the bike the foot peg mounts are. But my biggest pet peeve is definitely the BSR36 Carb. That thing is just a nightmare. It's not that it's a carb in general, like I don't mind carburetors. It's that this particular one is garbage. It's terrible to work on, and every time you drop it, it floods out. But I will say my favorite thing about this bike is probably the dash though. I love the orange backlight, and the digital speedometer and trip meter is just laid out nicer and bigger than the WR, in my opinion. So, in conclusion, these are both amazing machines, and it's obvious which one I would choose because, well, here we are 3 years later and I still have the machine, so... But whatever. But my choice is not going to reflect the masses. Both bikes are unkillable beasts that brought me nothing but joy. The WR is great with all its new technology and slightly better handling, but the DRZ just has that raw punch you'll never get from the WR. Ultimately, buy whichever one suits your needs the best. Hell, maybe it isn't even one of these bikes you need to be looking at. But regardless, I really appreciate y'all for watching, and thanks again. You all are amazing. Just remember, any questions, comment below. I get back to almost everyone and can answer most questions. Thanks.